got the remote. Showed you how to use the remote.
Live from the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences in beautiful downtown Raleigh, it's the Science Cafe with your host, Chris Smith.
Y'all are crazy. Hi, everybody. Happy Thursday. Welcome to the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. Hope you're glad to be here on a Thursday night. Everybody wave somewhere. You'll be waving at a camera. Say hi to all the people watching out on Facebook and live stream. If you didn't know, every Thursday night, right here in the Daily Planet Cafe at the museum, we bring you fun and exciting programs, interesting people solving and answering interesting questions using the tools and techniques of science. That's what we're all about here at the Museum of Natural Sciences, and we're really glad that we have the opportunity to bring you cool programs to this stage, meet interesting people, ask questions, and just learn what are people thinking about and what's going on out there in the world of science, technology, engineering, mathematics. But if there is ever a time that you find yourself unable to make it into the Daily Planet Cafe, which you should always do because the fudge brownies are incredible. But if you can't, you can always go to the museum's Facebook page or find our account on livestream.com, and you can watch this program every Thursday night from your computer. You can even type in comments, ask questions, and we'll try to get to those as well. So hi to all the folks who are watching online, and of course, we're really glad that all of you are here in our space as well. Tonight, we're going to be talking about some pretty cool stuff. So I hope you're all ready to learn something new, because that's what we're all about here at the Science Cafe. We've got Dr. David Hu. So Dr. Hu is in the house. And I knew some of you nerds would laugh at that. And he's actually brought his book. So he's going to be talking about his book, How to Walk on Water and Climb Up Walls. But if you, at the end of the talk, want to pick up a copy of this book, you can and you should. We'll be selling them right up here on the stage. And, of course, he's here, and I think he agreed to sign some of your copies. He brought his good pen, he said. And so make sure you pick up a copy. It's got some incredible people who made it to the back cover, right, with the book reviews part. Like Franz de Waal. Yeah, he's on here. He wrote, the good one here is Rob Dunn from North Carolina State University. Yep. Y'all didn't know, he's right here. I think he had the best quote, read this. That's what he said. No, he said a lot more than that. I won't read the whole thing. But obviously they got some really smart people who really enjoyed this book. So I think this group of really smart people would really enjoy it too. So I hope you all will pick up a copy of How to Walk on Water and Climb Up Walls at the end of today's program. Now, Dr. Hu is an associate professor of mechanical engineering and biology at the Georgia Institute of Technology, and he's an adjunct professor in physics. So I think when you combine mechanical engineering, biology, and physics, you get a book about how animals move and why that's important to us, or why the study of that could be useful to us. So, are you ready to learn something new? Please welcome to the stage, Dr. David Hu.
Thanks so much, Chris. This is my first time speaking about the book in Raleigh. I'm super excited to be here. This book's about animal movement. You probably think of animal movement as flocks of birds and schools of fish, but it's also things that are inspiring new technology. For example, things like this. The robots of the current day are basically made of hard, rigid platforms, things that put your car together, things that screw in nails. But the robots of the future are going to be soft. They're going to involve parts that actually mimic the motion of animals. Things that can basically comb your hair and brush your teeth without providing damage to humans. So how do we actually study these kinds of things in animals? What's a good model animal to study soft things? Well, you might think elephants are actually not very gentle, but they're actually one of the most gentle animals out there. Elephants eat about 190 kilograms per day, and that boils down to about 90 grams every single minute. So every single minute, they're eating 2 corns on the cob, and they're doing that for the entire day. And to pick things up, they use this trunk that weighs over 150 kilograms. But when they want to, they can basically apply this thing quite gently. And they always go back for the last bit. So that was actually a pile of potato cubes that the elephant is able to pick up and use the edge of its trunk. So this is something roboticists actually want to imitate. We want to build devices that actually not only use a tip, but also use the entire thing in a very efficient manner, just like this. The elephants don't just use the tip of the trunk. They can actually use air suction. So maybe some of you might recognize this sound if you're in a Chinese noodle restaurant. Chinese restaurant, you'll hear people really enjoying their noodles. And that's what the elephant does. To make sure it doesn't leave anything behind, it combines the basic power of a gripper and a vacuum cleaner, and it'll put it in its mouth. Sometimes it actually gets it stuck in the trunk and has to do this sneeze by tying its trunk in a knot and sneeze it out, but usually it works pretty well. So my adventures with, so these videos are actually taken at Atlanta Zoo, but my adventures with animal movement didn't just start at Atlanta Zoo. They started when I was growing up. This is me back in Chicago, and I've always been fascinated by animals. I didn't know it was a career. I didn't know what I could do with it, but I always was interested in how animals moved. And these are my parents. This is my father. He's a chemist. And my mother, she's also a chemist. And they always nurtured my curiosity. They always just told me I should continue to study what I find interesting. So I ended up using, I continued with these ideas of animal motion when I got mistakenly admitted to MIT at the end of high school. And I stayed there for 8 years until I got my PhD. And my PhD was actually on how insects walk on water. It was one of the first PhDs in the math department to look at the physics and math behind things that walk on water. What walks on water? Those are insects like this. Does anyone know what these are? Yes, water striders. You have them all over. They're also called pond skaters, and they actually stand on the water surface like this. This is actually 3 seconds in the life of a pond skater. Here, it's 2 males that are grappling, wrestling each other to get the attention of this female who's eating a tasty fruit fly in the back. And you can see they don't just walk. They can jump, they can leap, they can lie on their backs. They're virtual dogs on the water surface. And they do all this without breaking the water. They actually stand on the water surface like it's land. And it's made possible by the fact that each of these legs, they're about the thickness of my hair, a thickness of a human hair. And covered on this leg is 10,000 hairs per millimeter squared. It's the roughest surface in the animal kingdom. What that does is it allows the water strider to trap air pockets. So when it's actually standing on water, it's actually standing on 99% air. If you look from underneath, it looks like a pincushion. These things actually don't get wet. This technique of using surface tension, the ability of fluids to form a bubble, is only useful if you're really small. You might say, what's in it for me? What can I do to walk on water? And this is us, actually. You might think scientific experiments are kind of clean, but it's actually pretty messy. This is the real thing. These are one of the first photographs we took of insects walking on water. It's a special technique where we put special dye, thymol blue dye. Basically, it's acid. It basically gets turned on by acid. Originally, the entire painting is blue, but we shine light from below, and as the insect strokes across the water surface, it generates these rowing motions that push fluid backwards. And they do it in a subtle way. Each of those legs you see is the thickness of a human hair. It looks like a terrible oar. How can it actually push fluid backward? It would be like rowing with chopsticks. In actuality, because it's standing on the water surface, it actually generates very small dimples, and it can use those dimples that are filled with air to push on more water. So it's actually making an oar out of air pockets and using that to push itself forward. That large starburst in the center is actually a large chunk of the dye that that basically creates surface divergence and allows light to penetrate to the camera. The problem is if the insect gets too close, it'll actually sink through the water. So that's why we call this photo Icarus. And I was lucky at Georgia Tech. This is when I first started teaching. They used this on the cover of Fluid Mechanics Mechanical Engineering textbook, and they used it in some of the homework problems. So you can see, even in education, they're starting to mix the biology and engineering together. So like I said, what's in it for us? What can humans do to walk on water? This is the basilisk lizard. It runs so fast that it can actually support its weight on the water surface by slapping down very hard. Each slap is like a belly flop of its foot, and it slaps so hard that that force actually supports its weight. It's walking on two legs, so it's got to basically move its arms back and forth. It's very unstable. It looks a little silly, but here's it at real time, dashing across the water surface. Another trick it has is that it removes its leg before the cavity collapses. As you see divers dive in the Olympics, they'll generate a cavity when they slap the water. Here, it can actually pull its leg out before the cavity collapses, so the top of its feet actually don't get wet. It's literally walking on potholes of air. So the book is called How to Walk on Water and Climb Walls, and I figured at the end of this lecture, you should at least know how to walk on water. So from the two things we learned, how do you walk on water like a water strider? Well, then you need to have really wide feet so that the perimeter can use surface tension. Because surface tension is like a trampoline. It's like standing on a soap bubble. But the problem is we weigh so much that for us to walk on water like an insect, you would need feet about 10 kilometers in perimeter. Okay, that's not even going to fit into the lakes around here. What about if you're a basilisk lizard? Then it's actually start to be possible. If you've got feet about the size of two really large trash can lids, a meter squared. The only problem now is that you now actually have to generate speeds that are actually beyond the human capability. We can move our feet 15 meters per 30 meters per second through air. But once we start pushing water that's really dense, you actually have to generate a lot more power. You would actually need an exoskeleton that increases your power production by a factor of 15. And that's something my group is working on right now. So stay tuned. This is a device called Robo Strider. It was built by my college roommate, and it weighs about 1/3 of a gram and is about the size of my hand. It's about the size of the prehistoric water striders when they lived on Earth. There's its counterpart. That's the kind of water strider you see in your ponds and streams on the very top. It rose just like the water strider without breaking the water surface. Oops, let me try that again. So every time it rose, each of these legs just deforms the surface, just like saran wrap, and that pushes us forward. That's why it doesn't actually generate any splashes. It just deforms the surface and generates waves. So you can also call it a dry rowboat. When I did my PhD, I started realizing that to understand animal movement, you needed technology. And this is a great example of that. This is actually one of the first pioneers of animal motion research. Does anyone recognize this person? Yes, Muybridge. So Muybridge was trying to settle a bet by Leland Stanford. Stanford had his horse betting buddies couldn't decide if horses galloped with their feet all up in the air or on the ground. They didn't have computers or high-speed cameras back then, so they just had to guess, and they asked Muybridge to settle the dispute. So Muybridge set up a system where he had a series of cameras, each connected by strings, and every time a horse crossed a string, it triggered a single photo. And that emerged the basic collage of photos you see here, where you can clearly see on the top row, there is a stage where the horse is literally flying. This also led to something no one had imagined. This process led to a series of photos that became cinematography. So he learned when he played these very quickly, it looked like the horse was moving. And this became the first movie. The second movie, I think, was about a train. And then ... now we have Ant-Man. So the next story I want to tell is a little bit about modern technology. It's about 3D printing, and how we can actually use 3D printing to understand how animals move. These are 36 species of cats. This is the student who did this, Alexis Noel. She's actually from Raleigh, North Carolina. And her whole thesis in my lab was on animal tongues. How do tongues work? How are they used as a gripper and as a cleaner and as a brush? And the great thing about biology is that you don't just have one animal to look at. You have 36 all over the world, and they're all different sizes. So basically, we can do some comparisons to figure out, basically solve the mystery of what is the cat tongue used for. Here's a high-speed video of a cat tongue actually doing its thing. It takes a single second, and I've played it for you about 30 times slower. So you see, the cat tongue is not flat. It's very different from our tongue. If you've been licked by a cat, you feel like you've been sort of scratched by sandpaper. And it's because it has about 290 individual spines on its tongue that have the hardness of fingernails. Here's another video. You can see as it puts the tongue out, these spines can actually expand. The tongue is like a balloon. It can basically expand in all directions, and that can allow each of these spines to have better contact with all the hairs around it. Imagine a carpet cleaner that can engage with individual carpet fibers. And so these are tongues from this place called Tiger Haven. It's a location in Tennessee where all the illegal tigers in the U.S., when tigers get big, they go and they enjoy the rest of their lives in Tiger Haven. And we're able to actually capture the tongues of cats, bobcats, cougars, snow leopards, tigers, and lions. Don't worry, those cats were all dead before we got the tongues. And we were able to examine and see, did they lick like the cat or not? Do they have spines that are like the cat? And you can see that lion is 3 times bigger than the cat in every dimension. You know, it weighs a couple hundred pounds. But the very surprising thing is, the spines are identical. And this is what they look like. And this is only made possible with 3D scanning and 3D printing technology. This is the spine of your domestic cat, and it's identical to the spine on a tiger. There's 290 of these on the tongue. And it's got this curved base, so it basically stays embedded, kind of like a tooth. But it also has a very curious, it's got a groove, this top groove. And we actually didn't know what it was. And this is actually a common theme in the book. A lot of times the researchers were basically, exploring, we're trying to figure out what it was. So it was only by accident when Alexis was trying to push this tongue through a steak. We were trying to see if basically these things were good at rending meat. And we found that we could never get this spine clean. And it's because this little column is really good at imbibing fluids. If you ever look at hummingbirds, they drink through the exact same mechanism. Anytime you have a very, very small tube, a straw, you don't actually have to drink with pressure. You don't have to suck. The straw itself will spontaneously pull in fluid to reduce the surface area with the fluid. And so this spine is kind of like a lock and key for saliva. Every time the cat has its tongue in its mouth, the spines fill. And every time it comes out, it's got to find the appropriate place to put the saliva. And the only thing that can pull this, that you can see is locked pretty tightly in there. If you take the spine and I were to shake it upside down, no drops would fall out. But if you bring it in contact with the right key, stuff happens. And the key for cats is their hair. That's actually one of the cat hairs pulled through its own spine and is able to basically extract the fluid in the spine. Each of those spines can basically insert fluid really deeply into the fur. That's blue dye on the bottom left, showing that basically without these spines, cat fur would not be able to get clean. They wouldn't be able to get the dander, the blood, the fleas and things that were inside the inner layers. There's also really another important reason why cats need this. This is, for example, this top right image. This is a very soothing video of a cat licking itself. I mean, if we were to watch this for 5 minutes, I guarantee we would all fall asleep. So soothing. It's a thermal video. That means those bright areas are hot. So if I were covered in fur, if I were to basically, push my fur outward, the heat would escape. And that's what's happening. The only cold spot on the top is its cold, wet nose, the same nose that wakes you up in the morning. But then if you wait a few minutes after the cat's licked, you can see its paw has become dark again, cold. And that's because of the process of evaporation. Because cats are grooming two hours a day and they're leaving 48 grams of saliva, they actually lost all their sweat glands. Cats can't sweat. The only way they can stay cool is by grooming. And the only way that grooming works is by leaving fluid deep into the fur. So I'm a mechanical engineer. We saw this spine. We thought it was amazing. And we really wanted to see if we could improve it. And one thing I've been doing a lot is I've been combing a lot of little girls' hair. I have a 6-year-old daughter. We had a lice scare. We got a lot of lice the other day, so we had to the special lice comb and find the lice and things. And one of the things I noticed is that combs haven't changed in about 10,000 years. If you go to any comb, they have stiff, hard spines that are vertical. They're completely different from the cat tongue. The top is actually UV light illuminating the cat tongue. Each of these, this is basically nature's comb. Each of these spines are streamlined, so they face forward. As you pull it through fur, they don't stick out, so they have very little drag. And they also have, the bottom is basically the ones that we 3D printed. We 3D printed each of these spines and put them in a silicone. And when we test these things, we found that they have some surprising properties. And maybe you've encountered this. If you've tried to clean your own comb, maybe on a Friday night, with some ice cream and a movie, sitting there cleaning your comb, you'll find it's a very arduous process. These things were not meant to be cleaned. I think the companies are more than happy if you were to throw away your comb after you use it. Because the spines are stiff and vertical, you have to pick out each of these hairs individually. You can't basically pull them out collectively. But with the cat-inspired brush, and if you buy my book, I'll throw in a free cat-inspired tiger brush for $5.99, you'll find that if you just rub your finger in one direction, the spines are all facing one way. So you can get a convenient hairball that can be ejected into your slippers at 3 a.m. And that's exactly what the cats do. The cats have a series of bumps on the top of their mouth, and they can rub their tongue on these bumps and basically get all the complex matter out just by doing this single motion. And that's an important theme in nature. It's got to be able to be usable, but also be able to be cleanable without a huge number of implements. So I want to talk a little bit about pets. Raise your hand if you're a dog person. Raise your hand if you're a cat person. There's a lot of people with cats and dogs in this audience, so this is the right talk for you. This is one of the first studies I did when I was at Georgia Tech. We were interested in how dogs shake off water. It's an amazing process. I mean, sometimes I go into my office and close the door, and I'll try to repeat this on my own, on all fours, and it's very, very difficult, I tell you. You try to basically, you have to coordinate you start with your head and then coordinate with your shoulders, and then basically you've got to go all the way to the hind. And if you're really good, you can get the tail to basically get that last whipping action there. So they definitely have practiced for a very long time. So all this is actually made possible by central pattern generators. I'll talk a little bit about robots that are inspired by this. But they have an instinctual shake that removes the water. And it's not just dogs. In fact, all mammals had to evolve an ability to remove water anytime they got wet. The dog shaked about 4 times per second, but this mouse is about 10 times faster. A single eye blink would have 30 shakes of this mouse, 10 times faster than the dog. Each of these animals is basically pushing the limits of what mammals can do. You can see this one, it closes its eyes to shake. And that's because if you actually calculate the number of acceleration, the gravity, the basic number of gravities on this animal, is about 40 times Earth's gravity. And the human limit, if you get in a car accident, the human limit is about 10 times Earth's gravity. Colonel John Stapp, he was the first one to figure it out. He put himself on a rocket sled and slammed on the brakes. And he found that at 10 G, your eyeballs start popping out of your sockets. So the rats avoid that by closing their eyes really, really tightly. Last thing you want to be is clean, but have eyeballs popped out, even though Halloween's next week. So the things that are easiest to shake are actually the big animals. They only have to shake about twice per second. All these animals have different frequencies is because their radiuses are different. Imagine you're on a merry-go-round. If you go on a really big merry-go-round, you don't have to spin that fast to feel the forces. But if you go on the center, you better spin really fast in order to get that water to eject. One thing we discovered that was critical to this process is the animal's loose skin. This is one of the fun experiments we do. This is a pink straw that's directly on the back of the dog. So we just tape it. And the first thing you see is this dog's skin is very, very flexible. That back is actually swinging back and forth 90 degrees, left and right. And that's important. What that does is you get more bang out of your buck for each shake. Your vertebrae can only swing basically a third that much. These are wet rats shaking in X-ray. And you can see that basically they don't actually move. They don't move very much. Like this one on the right is particularly. Its backbone is pretty much in the same place. So having basically loose skin gives you three times the force. For example, if you got loose skin, I can go from basically 1 o'clock to 11 o'clock. Instead, I'll go from 3 o'clock to 9 o'clock. I'll get 3 times the amplitude, and then that's about 3 times the velocity, and then basically 9 times the amount of force. So I can get a huge amount more amount of force just by having loose skin. So one of the robots in my book that's based on principles like this is this. This is called Salamander Robotica. It's a robot that's actually not controlled by a computer. It's controlled by things called central pattern generators. So the way these animals can generate such robust and fast motion, the way that dog can shake its entire body, 4 times a second, 30 times a second for a rat, is all by the process of having little neural networks in its spinal cord. They're each sending these little blinking lights back and forth, and it's a combination of all these things that generate these waves. So locomotion is actually generated spontaneously, just from the communication between these little neural networks. The animal doesn't actually need a brain, and if it bumps into something, it basically automatically recovers, because there's no boss. Each of these parts sort of working independently sort of push it along. So for example, this robot controlled by these generators can go from basically a walking gait directly to a swimming gait without having any extra commands. It's because the body senses that there's more forces around it, and so it responds appropriately. It also, if it bumps into walls, it basically automatically turns around because it continues doing this motion. And animals need this, and so do you. This is the only way you could basically walk and talk at the same time, chew gum and run. It's all made possible by these central pattern generators, and we're just beginning to use these in robotics. I want to show you a few things on these animals. How much time do we have? We have a few more minutes. You know what these are? Fire ants. This is Raleigh, North Carolina. But maybe you haven't seen these. This is how you would actually collect fire ants. You drive by the side of the road and get a shovel and a bucket, and you put the dirt and the ants in the bucket. Now you have the problem of how do you get the ants out? What they do is we basically drip water, simulating rain. And if you do that overnight, the ants have enough time to actually combine themselves together and pull themselves out of their colonies. Then you can actually collect them from the water surface, because the fire ants are no longer just fire ants. They're basically a waterproof raft. Those are all actually ants. And they are amazing because they can actually generate the same structures that this water starter did, except the water starter had individual hairs. These fire ants, actually, each of them would sink, but instead, they can actually link their legs so tightly together that they can trap air pockets, and the entire thing becomes waterproof. This is basically nature's version of Gore-Tex, but it's basically a Gore-Tex jacket that kind of assembles itself. And its flexibility also helps it become super unsinkable. So a lot of my research is actually paid by the Army Research Office, and they're interested in basically renewable materials that can basically self-heal. Like, that is actually a clump of ants. It kind of has the elasticity of kind of like salad greens. The ants don't get hurt when you do this because they're 80% air. They're trapping all this air pockets in the network.
Okay, I don't think it's going to bounce back.
I think you saw that one enough. The video on the right is actually ants sinking. Very, very slowly, this penny is falling through ants. And it shows, if you wait a long enough time, the ants are actually acting like a fluid. And this is the exact type of thing that engineers are trying to build for bulletproof armor, self-healing bricks, structures that have little mechanical implements that can link and break and link and break without having long-term damage. And for the ants, it's made possible by a series of very small drops of glue. At the end of every time you see an ant walk up a wall, it's made possible by this very small drop of glue at the end of its foot. There's a small balloon that pops out, and basically there's a sort of a waterproof glue and a sort of a non-waterproof glue that allows it to stick to glassy surfaces and waxy surfaces. Those blue spots on that ant are actually, we flash froze one of these rafts and showed that those are all the spots that fellow ants are attaching to. So that's why it's such an impenetrable mesh. It's because the ants are so good at connecting to each other. So we're kind of like you. We don't have snow in Georgia. The closest thing we have to snow is ant snowballs. So this is actually how we end up doing our physics experiments. We make the ants as spheres, and then we look at how these spheres expand on the water surface. And when you just pull apart one of these spheres, this gives you an idea of how similar these things are to, like, melted cheese. Each of these ants is holding on to each other, but has a little brain that tells them to let go when the forces are getting too high. During ant warfare, they'll actually pull each other apart, leg by leg. But when they're attaching to friends, they know to basically break apart without breaking each other. So here's one of these spheres attached to the water surface. And this is what happens autonomously. One of these ant rafts, this is 3,000 ants, placed on the water surface, they automatically form this raft. That's always about 2 ants deep. They have a little thing in their brain that tells them when to be solid and when to be fluid. And that's important because The ants, if they were always fluid, then the ants would always just separate and they become little colonies. But by solidifying at the very end, they can build useful structures. Sometimes the structures are not just round. Here's an example when they actually basically extrude a leg. This is called a pseudopod, a false leg, and grab something. And there's boats. These are small robotic boats built by UPenn investigators that are based on similar principles of the ants, called swarming, where they'll link together like the ants and then combine and build this sort of more capable structure. And one day we're going to have trucks crossing these. So that was a little discussion of the robots in the book. I want to name one other robot. This is actually based on humans, which I'll talk about in the book too. Maybe some of you don't know, but human walking was long thought to be impossible to beat. If you actually walk a mile, it only takes 2 tablespoons of sugar. It's one of the most efficient gaits out there. And for almost 100 years, they had this contest to basically try to make a prosthetic that could improve, how many miles you can walk. And only recently, just 3 years ago, they succeeded. And they did it based on looking at the gait of a human. And they found that we've evolved to have very efficient gaits, so efficient that we don't even need a brain to walk. This is a robot without a brain. It's called the Cornell Need Walker. It's like one of these large Tinker toys, and it walks steadily downhill for many steps. The big version of this actually was able to walk, for days and days on end. And it's made possible by the fact that the leg is a pendulum. It swings, and it naturally stores energy. Basically, it's changing its height and changing its speed. So anytime you basically think you're losing energy, you're just storing it in the leg. So the grad student who worked on this, he had to fashion particular robot feet so that the robot would always sort of shift towards the center. But if you think sleepwalking is not possible, just look at this robot. You really don't need a brain to walk steadily. So the book is not just about the robots, it's also about having fun. A lot of people in the locomotion world, we combine our hobbies with our work. And I started doing this a few years ago when I was changing diapers, and I noticed that kids urinate for a really long time. Even though they're really small, you'd think they would take less time, but they actually take a really long time. And I decided to go investigate this. So I found some willing students who are interested in medical degrees. One of them is actually a professional urologist after taking part in this study. He loved this so much he just couldn't leave. And we learned about this so I won this thing called the Ig Nobel Prize. It's an award for making people laugh and think. And it's for the biological principle that animals urinate in about the same amount of time, from a dog to an elephant. So this is basically the evolution of the urinary system. When you're really small, urinating is actually difficult. The surface tension actually pushes the urine back in the body. So the best you can do is actually generate small urine gumballs, just like this. But as you get bigger, you get things that probably resemble your mid-afternoon break, or maybe what you're going to do after this talk. This is a goat urinating. It fills a small bucket. These are called an instability. This is due to the small fluid waves that get propagated down the urine jet stream. This is what engineers call fluid fish bones. We generate this sort of sheet of urine. It kind of looks like a sheet. And this is about a bucket full of urine. And this is my favorite experiment because I got study number 1 and study number 2 all in the same video. And the amazing thing about this elephant is that it urinates at the same time as a dog. It's about 21 seconds. And it's made possible by the fact that they have these urethras. And doctors and veterinarians didn't know this before. But an elephant has if you measure it, it has about 20 liters of urine in its bladder. It's about a kitchen garbage can. That's what my students tell me they had to bring over at 6 a.m. in the morning to catch the elephant urine. To fill that bucket, it's got to release urine at a very high rate, at about the rate of 5 shower heads. And it does so by the fact that it has this long pipe. Even for male and female elephants, it's about 1 meter long, and what it does is accentuate the force of gravity. It basically, if you've got a long pipe, the fluid imagine that it's like a waterfall rather than just a very thin amount of fluid. And if you don't believe me, you can try this experiment at home. These are 3 containers with a urethra that accentuates the force of gravity. And you can make these containers arbitrarily big. As long as you have the appropriately sized urethra underneath, you can get them to empty in the same time. These Japanese doctors were so fascinated by the study, they actually interviewed 2,000 Japanese people about their urination times. I was on a Japanese game show, and they found that this is actually really useful for doctors, because before, to measure urine speed, they had to use lasers. But now they found that this is a really good basically good measure of how strong your bladder is. When you're 21, you'll urinate for an average of 20 seconds. But as some of you in the audience know, as you get older, it takes longer. In fact, when you're 80, it takes about 30 seconds on average. And this is exactly correlated to basically how strong the bladder muscle is. The longer you urinate, the basically weaker that bladder muscle. So now doctors, one day, I hope, will ask you, how are you? And how long did you urinate today? This is another one of the animals in my book. I won't get a chance to talk about it, but this is this example of a scientist doing research on whether snakes can fly. And the scientist actually had to take snakes to the top of a tower. He was actually afraid of heights and afraid of snake bites. But he managed to throw snakes off the tower, and he found all of them fell like a rock except for one. There's a paradise tree-flying snake from Singapore, and it can sail as well as a flying squirrel. And it's all made possible by the fact that it actually has ribs. It actually has ribs that can open up just like a wing. And so every time it flies, it opens up its ribs and basically holds its breath and is able to get into this gliding surface. And this special gliding surface is a very different shape than modern airfoils. If you notice, the wings of your airplane will have sort of a curved shape, but this is a triangular shape. And scientists think that this helps the snake basically deal with updrafts and basically makes it more robust. So if you like this talk, feel free to tell people. I'll be at Carter Center in 2 weeks. I'll be at Smithsonian, Washington, D.C. next week. I'll be in Colorado in 3 weeks. The book's available on Kindle, if you like Kindle. There's an Italian actor who read the book, and it's on Audible. It's been translated in Korean and Chinese. And after the show, I bought an acid-free pen, so I'm happy to sign any copies you like. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. You got time for a few questions?
Yeah, let's do it.
Science Cafe audience always has questions. If you do have a question, raise your hand. I'll bring a microphone to you, or Katie will bring a microphone to you, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can in the time that we've got left. So, hands up if you want to get us started. But otherwise, I'm glad that you threw a human example in your presentation, because I was starting to feel kind of down on myself.
Oh, you can't fly like a snake.
All the other animals out there have cool stuff they can do, and I can just walk around. So, but I can pee at the same time a goat does.
Yes, or a horse.
Oh, you didn't cover how anoles and certain lizards can climb up walls using the odd forces and little teeny tiny hairs on their feet.
Oh, that's right. How to actually
I was watching one
walk up walls. I got to leave you something to read about in the book.
I was watching one the other day, and they don't seem to have to pull hard to get their foot off the surface either, which seemed a little odd.
I would say this is probably the #1 most famous discovery in this field was this Velcro discovery made by people looking at thistle. And #2 is probably the gecko hairs. Their legs are covered in basically a Christmas tree of hairs. Not just our head, but basically things that go into branching and more branching and more branching. I think it goes down to 3 or 4 levels. And each of these hairs provides a very small surface area of contact and provides a very small force called a van der Waals force. It's forces between molecules that are very close together. But it's enough that the gecko can actually support its weight. And they've been trying to scale this up. Like if you've looked at the news, Colbert Report, they've been trying to build things like Spider-Man to crawl up walls. And they actually did succeed 2 years ago. They were able to build a human-sized device and crawl glass walls. And one of the big difficulties is the fact that you have to make this thing so that you basically can attach and detach. And that's one of the tricks of the gecko hairs. It basically is called anisotropic. And a lot of things in nature are like the cat tongue. But basically the gecko, it basically attaches. So if you pull one way, it applies a very large force. If the gecko applies a slight force in the opposite direction, the foot completely releases. And it's because of the angle of these hairs and the way they contact with the surface. So when the humans actually tried to do it, they found it only really worked well on flat surfaces, so we can really only climb glass walls. And they also had to figure out a way to redistribute the forces. right now the gecko hairs, they're really good at redistributing the forces. So if you've got a small sort of patch that has low force, the whole arm doesn't just fall off. And they've had to do that with like a sort of series of levers. But that was the big difficulty, like scaling it up, going from 1 hair to like 1,000,000 hairs, and still have the whole thing attached without having cracks form.
So I'm curious. At the very beginning, you talked about how a lot of the robots that people might be familiar with are in factories. They don't really move or act like biological things or like animals out there. So are robots based on wildlife actually more efficient, or do they do better jobs than the maybe things we think of as being clunkier?
The robots we have right now are really optimized for flat surfaces and no surprises. They're good for repetitive jobs with the sort of difficult and heavy materials. But the ideas, the roboticists' ideas, they want to build robots that can go out into the everyday world. Robots that can basically go into your kitchen, clean up the cluttered mess, cut some vegetables, and then make it into a soup. And there's no robots that can do that. And basically to deal with that, it basically needs some properties from nature. You've got to basically take some abilities of dealing with complex environments. For example, that robot that you saw walking and then swimming and changing gait. In nature, there's sometimes a lot of different terrain. It's not just sort of a flat linoleum floor, but it goes from one surface to another. And robots are really good at being robust, like still able to move even though the terrain shifts sort of dramatically. So the robots that we use for car factories are not going to change. But the robots, for example, you've got this micro-flying insect buzzing around. If that's going to go outside where there's wind gusts and birds and bees, it's going to have to probably look a lot like an insect to take advantage of those situations.
And then does building these robots and figuring out how to make them work teach us anything in return about the creature we're trying to base them on?
Oh, yes. I mean, studying animals is difficult. The animals, I'll talk about in the book, a lot of times they bite the people trying to study them. A lot of times they'll escape. I mean, I'm actually known as the most hated biology professor on campus because snakes have escaped my lab, cleaning people won't come in, ants are escaping. We study mosquitoes, no one like that. So animals are small and they have their own ideas. So a lot of times people will build larger scale versions to test basic ideas. And robots before they can actually do anything effectively, they're going to be using a lot as sort of test beds.
But I have a question. Yeah, you've shown so many animals and different phenomenon that they're. Do you go for do you watch the animals and then study the phenomenon, or are you thinking, wow, what is an example of this phenomenon? And I'm going to find the animal. Which comes first? What do you do all day?
What besides watching elephant urination videos
and he goes to the zoo?
Well, I rely on the biology community. So for a couple years, I was really interested in how elephants pee and poo. I was just filming them very intently from behind. And the zoo curator, the curator of mammals, she said, you know, we've got other things in our zoo just besides elephant butts. I was like what? She said, have you ever thought about the front of the elephant? And so she was telling me that her staff is fascinated by how elephants grab things, and they actually don't understand it at all. And so I actually came in one day and I saw it, and I said, I know this is going to be a good robotics-inspired paper. So sometimes I actually just listen to people that are biology experts, and they'll steer me in the right direction. A lot of other times that's the great thing about this area. You can get ideas from everyday life. I mean, looking at your kids urinate, combing them. We are mammals too, and we do all the things that other animals do. Basically, we can learn things from our dog and our cat that might actually have, huge consequences on all the cats out there, all the different species, or all the different kinds of mammals. So it's kind of like the area around us is kind of like a window into the entire evolutionary history. And sometimes I'll just go from everyday things and we'll go to the zoo to really test stuff out. Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about the network or the community of people that use the information that you cull as you and your students study the mechanisms of the physiology of all these cool animals that you're observing? Who then takes what you figure out and tries to think about possible applications in the world?
I mean, sometimes it can vary. For example, we did this study on how bees clean themselves and how they're covered in these spines. And every time they groom themselves, they can actually shed like 10,000 little pollen particles. And we were just interested in how bees groom, but actually end up being applied for these medical patches. They were thinking of these basically a dissolvable patch that can hold on to medicine very, very closely for long periods of time. And right now they had just tried adhesives and never tried this idea of having very small spines to put it on. So a lot of times I'll meet people sort of all over the world in different fields. Like this urination research ended up being used by, there are these doctors designing these urinary implants, basically prostheses, and they needed some kind of testing method, basically some way to determine if their prosthesis is working. So now their rule of thumb is it's got to urinate for 21 seconds every 3 hours, and they do that for days and days and days to make sure it works. So I think we'll study the animals and we'll find basically physicians, and a lot of times there'll be people we haven't met. They'll say, hey, this actually solves one of the problems in my field, and I never thought of this, and they'll use it.
But so it's a little random then. It depends on who you bump into at a conference or what friends.
Yeah.
What other friends?
Well, there's also a huge number of, I talk about some roboticists in the book that are just purely building robots. And a lot of them are actually end up taking a lot of these biology classes and really learning. They really want to understand what the principles of the animals are doing before they try to build Robo Cheetah, Robo Snail, these other sort of biomedic robots. And that's an increasing community. And there's a huge number of young people, especially, that are interested in building robots. And a lot of them, the first thing they'll do is open a biology textbook, watch Discovery Channel, or hopefully I'm thinking they'll read the book. Yeah.
Right away. So I'm kind of curious, the robotics and the technologies that you use are very modern, so it casts the whole field that you're in that with that imprimatur. But I'm thinking about flight and about people that were trying to, conquer flight or study flight. I'm just curious about where you think your field had its stirrings, or who were standouts in a sort of an historical perspective that sort of helped you, or what built the field of today? What shoulders did you stand on, or the field stands on?
Of this area, biomechanics.
Yeah.
I think a lot of it started actually in the real science really started in the 1940s. I mean, even before then, Galileo and a number of others were throwing sawdust in the air and watching pigeons fly through it, and saw that this pigeons would actually generate this fluid motion. That's how he based a lot of his pictures of turbulence and things. But they started getting really serious in the 40s when the biologists started having this problems they couldn't solve. They called them paradoxes. The 1940s saw basically two big paradoxes that drew people outside biology into the field. One of them was called the Dolphin Paradox, Gray's Paradox. And it was these sailors driving the ship, and they noticed that dolphins could easily keep up pace with them. And so Gray, he did the first calculation of basically measuring the drag on a dolphin and getting an idea of how much power it could generate. And he concluded that the dolphin was not capable of swimming that fast. And it drew a huge number of people to the field. There became a lot of people interested in this thing called shark scales. I mean, you've probably seen Speedo. Even now, they'll have these shark-inspired swimsuits. And for a long time, I talk about in the book how there was this arms race to figure out what is the secret to have dolphins and sharks swim so fast. So it's basically starting to apply very simple calculations to understand these things, and then gathering all this sort of interest into it. And that was in the 40s, and now there's a huge number of I'm an engineer that are interested in biological things.
So
Yeah, he's got one.
never mind, you have a question.
I know there's interest in building robots to explore, earthquake areas and such like that to look for trapped victims. Is any of what you're doing going to be of application into developing those systems?
So there's this current challenge to get a robot to save a person's life in an earthquake situation. As you mentioned, when there's a bunch of basically broken rubble, it's not safe for people and also too expansive for people to sort of go and look for things. So they're thinking of very small disposable robots that have the ability, like animals, to squeeze into very small crannies, bring a camera, some kind of device to detect something, and basically able to scan the area. We built a few robotic snakes that are able to sort of take advantage of basically having really long bodies and slither up terrain. I don't know if you noticed, but snakes can actually climb trees, even though they have legs, and it's made possible by the fact they have individual sort of belly scales They're like individual fingernails that can actually move up and down. And so we built this sort of robotic snake, and with this movable belly, it was able to sort of climb almost vertical. And without it, I mean, without looking to nature at all, the snakes won't be able to climb. And there's a robot city in Texas A&M where they're trying different types of robots and bio-inspired robots in sort of simulated earthquake disaster situations. It's a very difficult job. A lot of it not to do with the locomotion. I think that's getting more understood, but a lot to do with the human-computer interface. When you're controlling this robot, you're basically looking through this little periscope, and you basically can't figure out where you are. And so these robots are just getting stuck in places. So it's still going to be a long way to go before we have something that's like elegant, both computer-wise and locomotion-wise. Yeah.
What would you say is the hardest part of your job?
The hardest part of my job is, so I didn't mention this, but there's people that study animals like us, we actually get picked up by by politicians. But every year there's politicians trying to shut down science. I mean, I don't think any of you would want to do that because you're at the Science Cafe at 8 p.m. on a Thursday. But there are politicians who are professionally trying to shut down all science in the U.S. And what they do is they pick on things that get the public's attention, that are very engaging. And so they'll pick little snippets out of this research and make it sound really silly. They won't talk about any of the applications. They won't talk about any of the discoveries. And they've been doing this for the last 20 years. Every month they've been giving a Golden Fleece Award. They've ended scientists' careers. And I was actually chosen to be on this thing called the Waste Book, the most wasteful science in the U.S. And I was actually responsible for 3 out of 20 studies. That's 15% in the entire country. I thought that's pretty good for just one person. And so I basically I wrote a response to Scientific American and just spoke about why this stuff is beautiful and why it's interesting to study. And they can be of like unforeseen applications. And, but it's still something that I think, anything that's engaging, I think is also can lead to people misusing it.
Thank you.
Let's give him a round of applause.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. All right, well, this is the part of the show where everybody gets in line to buy the book. We have them for sale right up here. You can pay with your card, you can pay with cash, so come pick up Dr. Who's book. And thanks for coming out to the Science Cafe. I hope we'll see you again here real soon. Good night, everybody.